Welcome, everyone. Today's podcast is an edited version of the security-themed webinar recorded October 26, 2017. The podcast was organized by Brad Reese of the North American Field Marketing Organization and was hosted by Campus Technology Magazine. This podcast includes highlights from the live webinar that we believe would be of interest to sales reps as it paints the picture of how cybersecurity is being handled in higher education, who the key players are, and what they care about. We join in as moderator Linda Briggs introduces the speakers.
I'm Linda Briggs. I'm a contributing editor here at Campus Tech, and I'll be your moderator today. At this point, let me introduce and welcome our guest speakers for today. Deirdre Woods is founder and principal of Deirdre Woods Technology Advisors. She's also a Dialogue faculty member and former CIO and Associate Dean of the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. Also joining us is John Mulhern III. He is the Principal Technology Advisor with ISC at the University of Pennsylvania. John has worked at the university for over 25 years. He's currently Principal Technology Advisor, a role in which he focuses on the computing needs of everyone from first-year students to emeritus faculty members. John also manages technical vendor relations. And finally, please welcome Kevin Boyd, who is the Chief Information Officer at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. In that capacity, he has responsibility for the information technology at Chicago Booth's 2 campuses in Chicago, as well as campuses in both London and Hong Kong.
The security landscape is evolving quickly, and higher education has some unique challenges. We're also seeing a new role emerge, that of the Chief Information Security Officer, or CISO. Here's the introduction Deirdre Woods gave on the landscape.
If we think about cybersecurity, you've all seen these numbers over and over again, right? None of this is particularly great news. Some numbers here, over 22 million cyber threats daily, huge amounts of cost in terms of financial costs and damage to reputations. We've seen this over and over again. And then on the other side, we see, that cybersecurity jobs are extremely high demand. Employment is at this point 0%. In some places I've seen it's even negative percentage in terms of employment. So, and I think that's happening for several reasons. First of all, we lead such digital lives, so, all of us are connected all the time. The other issue is that cybercrime, unfortunately, is getting increasingly sophisticated.
When it comes to security threats, education is third of the top 10 sectors breached. EDUCAUSE has consistently ranked cybersecurity at the top of the community's risk poll. Deirdre Woods goes on to outline the challenges in higher education.
Some of the issues are phishing and social engineering. We see this increased need for end-user awareness training and education. I certainly believe very strongly in that. However, I think we also need to think about recovery from incidents as well. There's only so much we can actually ask our users to do in terms of awareness. We have, in the past, there have been limited resources, for information security programs, but that's really changing. And you'll hear more from John and Kevin about this, because I think there is a lot of heightened awareness. And I think, if we take a step back and think about why issues about information security, cybersecurity are different in higher education, the mission of our colleges and universities are to create and disseminate knowledge. That's what we do. We do it through our teaching and research mission. We do it in sort of the intersection of these areas. And, this is borderless, right? Research goes across the globe. One might publish an article with a colleague that lives in another country. Our students live in many places. They travel many places. They bring their devices with us. Universities also have very high-performing, fast networks to share data and information. And there are, generally large amounts of data storage available as well because of the teaching and research mission that happen at universities. We're also required, we have some federal requirements as well that give us a little heightened, we have higher requirements. FERPA, there's a piece about protection of student data. There's a higher level of protection of student data that is required. And in HIPAA for patient data, there's also, there's protections that are required about both paper and electronic patient records. One interesting feature is that even if your institution or your college or university does not have a medical school, a university health system associated with your institution, you may still have HIPAA protected data that perhaps one of your faculty members is using for a project. Some of the things we're seeing is, the CIO and the IT department is still going to be very responsible for the overall technology strategy and leadership. building a good technical environment, high-performing technical environment, supporting the mission of the institution, supporting teaching, learning, and research, working with business partners to deliver services. And I would still say their role is very much still involved in protecting the institution's intellectual property and reputation.
As Deirdre Woods points out, there are a lot of challenges. But who is responsible for implementing change and being accountable to the Board of Trustees or similar roles?
CISOs now are increasingly at a higher level. As you notice, it's the C word. It's no longer information security officer or information security specialist. It's a chief information security officer. There's risk. They're looking much more in risk assessment management, and I would say response and recovery, working on policies that will go across units at universities. Certainly, cybersecurity is cyber and it's technology related, but there's legal involved. There's communications involved. So I think we're seeing more of that. Certainly managing incidents and response, awareness and training.
Where CISOs report into is changing. Over 80% of them report into the CIO, but their responsibilities are expanding beyond purely technology. Reporting chains are starting to shift to the president or chancellor, and increasingly they're going beyond the university reporting structure and accountable directly to the Board of Trustees or other departments such as legal, with dotted lines to the other departments. John Mulhern III joined the conversation next to give a perspective from the University of Pennsylvania.
First of all, setting the stage here, Penn is large for an Ivy, not necessarily for a university as a whole, but large for an Ivy. We operate under a interesting budgeting model that actually makes our decentralization official as far as funding. And we have approximately 26 schools and centers across the university that have their own IT infrastructure, which makes a CISO's job quite challenging. Three central themes that I have for you here today are the first one is that missions matter. What the particular direction of your college or university's missions are overall dictates the approach. And I kind of make that into something like not all security initiatives are equal at your institution. Different ones may be more effective, different ones may be, less hard to achieve, et cetera. And that's often something that gets lost when people look at this laundry list of things that they need to be doing as opposed to what their college or university actually is going to most effectively be able to do. The second thing, and I've seen this over time, is the idea of explainer-in-chief. The CISO can get hired for all kinds of reasons, but increasingly the CISO's skill is really all around communication. And that is incredibly important. In many ways, our CISO may be more visible to our Board of Trustees than our CIO. It's not that they don't see the CIO, but the CISO is the one who's often coming to them, briefing them on things like institutional risk, et cetera. And so Josh Beeman loves to say that CISO actually stands for Chief Information Splaining Officer, and there really is something to that. He needs to understand technical issues. He needs to have a vision for where we need to go, but he really needs to be able to communicate those not just to the Board of Trustees and the President and the other senior executives, but also to organizations across the campus. And so that's an incredibly important thing. And then the third central theme that I have is agility built upon organizational capability. And that is, the whole concept is that, as they say, winter is always coming. You need to build an agile organization that can respond to new threats, but you also have to have some degrees of maturity in that organization. And as Deirdre had already mentioned, this is really tough when there's essentially 0% unemployment amongst qualified security personnel. That's kind of the three central themes that we've come across.
Both John Mulhern and Kevin Boyd work at larger universities, but we wanted to know if there's a difference between how these larger institutions work versus a smaller college or even a community college.
A little bit to set the stage about Booth. Booth is the business school for the University of Chicago, and we're in somewhat of an interesting position in that we operate a fairly independent IT organization within the larger university. That's often within large universities where you have often the business school or the medical centers. that are running somewhat independent IT organizations within the broader organization. And within the University of Chicago, the university is providing a thin layer of firewall and intrusion detection around everything that comes into the organization. But then we really run our own operations and our own security for Booth. What's very interesting about our alums as well as our students is in many cases, our students are coming out of some of the top corporations and going back into many of the top corporations. And why I say that's interesting is that their expectations for IT and their expectations for our security tend to be very high. The other thing that presents some unique both opportunities and challenges for us is the fact that we have a very global footprint. So we have 2 campuses in Chicago, but then we also run full programs, full MBA programs out of London and Hong Kong as well. And that we find creates some very interesting security challenges for us. One of the things that we've talked about, the title says, are threats increasing at universities? But I think the reality is that most of us would say, yes, of course they are. It's difficult to attend a conference, it's difficult to attend a peer school event and not have people talking about some of these things. Certainly within the last 6 months, ransomware has been in the headlines of just about every major newspaper in the country, and it certainly had an impact on a number of universities, although for ransomware, in many cases, it was some of the international universities more so than domestic, but the impact has been there. There have been some fairly large U.S. universities that have been heavily impacted by denial of service attacks. Zero-day attacks are something that I think are an increasing challenge for us, and I think are going to become more so, where it used to be that we'd be warned about something, but the message often was, but it's not an attack that we're seeing in the wild. And I think increasingly that's changing, and at the same time that these attacks are becoming public, unfortunately the hackers are already exploiting them. And in that same vein, there are more and more scripted attacks where there are these sites on the internet, on the dark web, that are very easy for hackers to download the attacks and do them. It's not something that they have to figure out how to do, but rather someone has figured it out and is sharing with others. And of course, Deirdre mentioned phishing. I think it's hard to be at a university these days and not be dealing with the phishing challenge. It is becoming broader, and certain the schools that I talk with, it's becoming more and more targeted. So it's not just asking people to log in because your inbox is full. It's addressing people very specifically. The other thing that we're starting to see is more nation-state actors getting in the game. So at the University of Chicago, we have faculty working on research that is of interest to a variety of different nations. In some cases, it may be faculty who are writing about the economy of those nations. In other cases, it's simply faculty who are doing research that is of interest, that other nations would like to get a jump start on some of that same research. I think one of the challenges in the security space is striking a balance. My background is the corporate world, and it was interesting when I came to a university how it was sort of the opposite of what I was used to in the corporate world, how wide open our universities tend to be. And obviously there's a reason for that. There's so much collaboration going on between researchers across different universities. And I think there's always been a tension between what we want to do, what the CISO wants to do with information security, and not doing things that are going to make collaboration more difficult for the researchers at our institution. One of the things we've been seeing is that in the last 12 to 18 months, there seems to be more awareness and willingness at the top levels of our organization. And I'm seeing the same thing as I'm talking to peers. The executive level, at the board level, there seems to be more awareness and willingness to proactively address the risks and the threats, which really brings me to the last point. One of the things that we really look for with our CISO is to adopt more of a risk-based security model. I think one of the challenges that every CISO has today is getting out of the sort of whack-a-mole approach. That's something that we jokingly refer to it as. It seems like every week there's, the latest challenge, the latest threat. It's that ability to step back and really say, okay, we have a lot of different things that we could be investing our time and dollars in the security space. Let's make sure we're really looking at it holistically. Let's make sure we understand what the risks are and that we're having a conversation around risk, and then that we're allocating resources and investments based on risk. And certainly our experience has been that leads to much more productive conversations with top-level executives across the institution, and in many cases with boards and leadership council.
Our moderator, Linda Briggs, continues the conversation by diving into a few follow-on questions for the panel.
Before we move into the Q&A, I have a couple questions. Kevin, I want to bring you in on this. So you have an interesting challenge with multiple campuses, London, Hong Kong, and there in Chicago as well. How do you deal with that? Are there some spectacular incidents you've had to deal with, and any advice on that?
I don't know about spectacular incidents, but I guess what I would say has been incredibly helpful for us is the planning that goes into incident response. So it's really putting procedures in place. It is making sure that the team members are involved in that we walk through it, that before something happens, we actually talk about what we're going to do if something bad happens. What we found is you never know when something is going to happen, and it's often at an inconvenient time, and key people may be on vacation. What you really want is have actually put some thought into it and have something that have a playbook that you can reference.
Interesting, and I'm guessing that's a playbook that you have to continually update. I mean, you talked about phishing is now a new threat and some other things that are happening, so you have to revisit that on a regular basis?
Yes, absolutely.
At the end of the presentation, Linda Briggs fielded some questions from the audience, starting with Kevin Boyd.
Kevin, the question is, do you have any recommendations on communicating with senior leadership or boards about these issues of security? You are senior leadership, but any tips for others?
One of the things that has been sort of an interesting lesson about communicating with boards, and I think more and more CISOs and CIOs are having communications with the boards of directors at universities about security. A key lesson for us has been that many of the folks that are on the university board of directors, they are executives at public corporations, they are on other boards of directors, and it's important to recognize that they're probably coming into that conversation with a public company mindset. And so what that means is they may be having the same conversations about security, but they're doing it about what security is like in the corporate world. And so if you think about what I said earlier about how the corporate world is completely locked down and the university is not so locked down, what that means is that when you start to have the conversation with the board of directors about security, it's really important to start with some education, to start with some level setting. If you don't do that, these conversations can be really painful because they're coming at it from a very different perspective. And their mindset may be, well, why isn't everything completely locked down? Because that's the world that they're used to. And so that's something that I think has been important for us and that I would say to others is make sure you know your audience, really understand who that audience is, what is their background, and make sure that you're tailoring that message so that you get them to a common understanding of, what is security like at the university, why is it that way, and then have the conversation about, where do we want to take security at the university.
John Mulhern also chimed in, agreeing that a level set was important while adding some additional thoughts.
I also, however, will say that some of the discussions, I think, are so much easier, in some ways almost too easy, because since these folks are often on boards of companies and stuff like that, they are often now have some legal responsibility to those companies, so they come kind of preset for this. And my great example of this is a couple years ago, the university always looks at what its institutional risks overall are, and they picked information security, and our CISO went to the Board of Trustees and presented on it, and he asked for 18 different things. He gets through this presentation, and he's thinking he'll get, maybe a third, maybe half. And essentially the trustees responded with a, when do we begin? So that case that he thought was going to be really hard and that he had to ask for a ton of things in the hope of getting some, he got all 18. Now that raised all kinds of other challenges, and he has a great presentation about, be careful of what you wish for. But it was not the response that we'd been used to getting, and I think it is increasingly the kind of response we get.
Both John Mulhern and Kevin Boyd work at larger universities, but we wanted to know if there's a difference between how these larger institutions work versus a smaller college or even a community college. Deirdre offered her perspective in having worked with a diverse assortment of institutions.
Yeah, I think it can really vary. I mean, so one of the things both Kevin and John have at Penn and the University of Chicago is, they work in very highly decentralized environments. Each school sort of, it works to its own mission. It's supposed to be entrepreneurial and have funding and sort of work it's separately and then become a part of a loosely coupled university. At a college where, you're perhaps just have undergraduate programs or maybe one small other program and where your leadership is much more concentrated, I think the role is frankly harder and easier, right? If you're in a smaller college, you're perhaps not having to persuade your colleagues in other schools and the institutes and so on and so forth to sort of all, work together on cybersecurity because it's very important to work together. So, the problem may be a little bit easier to solve because you are in a smaller institution and you are able to gather all your parties more easily. On the other hand, you may have fewer resources to actually execute and implement either prevention measures or recovery measures or so on and so forth. You may or may not necessarily have the ability to talk to your higher leadership as a great degree. Again, I think that's changing, but, cybersecurity was not as of great interest. Presidents and provosts and academic officers all speak to each other, and chief business officers all do speak to each other. So I think that is also permeating into small colleges as well.
Risk is another huge issue that CISOs need to weigh. How do you balance the risk versus reward question, especially in higher education where you have so many competing needs and associated costs? John Mulhern gave us his perspective at the University of Pennsylvania.
I think that's a constant challenge. I watch our security organization, and at Penn we have the central security organization, and then each of the schools and centers has an individual security person or persons, and we're constantly trying to balance what the ask is because you don't want to get in the way. At Penn we really are trying to cure cancer, and you don't want to be the security person that kept them from finding that last thing that solved that problem, right? So it's a constant back and forth, and it takes a lot of effort to get to the people who are making the decisions around not just the security components of things, but everything else that's going on. But it's a challenge. We do not have a recipe for this as yet. We have kind of a checkoff list of different kinds of constituents that we try to talk to when we're doing something that we consider is significant in the security area. We have open security groups and tightly closed and selected security groups. I wish that we had some kind of magical chart that you just filled out and at the end it spit out a number and told you whether to do it or not.
John Mulhern is in search of a magic chart to help him measure risk versus reward. Is it possible that Chicago Booth has one that Kevin Boyd will share?
I wouldn't say I have a magic chart, but I guess the way I would answer that is that I'm always encouraging our security folks to try and articulate risk in business terms. When we're talking about risk, that's really it's not a technical conversation. It is, if we do this or if we don't do this, here's what could happen. Here's what the consequences of doing or not doing this would be. If someone gets access to this information, here is the reputational risk to the school. This is alumni information. There are consequences to alumni donors, that may have far-reaching consequences to the school. If student information is compromised, here are the consequences to the school if that happens. That risk question, it's all about putting that into, not technical terms, but very much the consequences to the school, the consequences to the institution, or the consequences to the particular constituencies, whether that be alumni or reputational risk. I think that's really what becomes very important. It's not a formula. It's not particularly black and white, but I think getting better at having that conversation is really important, and I think that's what helps you build credibility with the leadership of the institution and certainly with boards of directors.
Cybersecurity is certainly a topic that's not going away. Be sure to understand how security is being handled at your customer's institution and how Lenovo can help support their mission. If you have any comments about this podcast or topic ideas, please email us at lenovopodcasts@dialogue.com. group.com.